There are some questions that have been with humanity forever, questions that we all think about at some point. And perhaps the biggest one of all, the one that sits right at the heart of everything, is this: does God exist? This quote really gets right to the heart of it, doesn't it? We just want a straight answer. But as you can probably guess, it's not quite that simple. The real understanding isn't in a yes or no, but in exploring the ideas themselves. And that's exactly what we're going to do together. We're going to calmly break down the logic on both sides of this timeless debate. So here's our roadmap. We'll start with the rules of the debate, then we'll look at a case for God's existence built on pure logic. After that, we'll explore a counterargument that comes from human history. We'll also touch on the really tough question of suffering, and we'll finish with two very different ways of seeing the world. To really get a handle on this, we're going to look at it through the lens of a fascinating debate between two really prominent thinkers. And they approach this question from completely opposite ends of the spectrum. On one side, we have Mufti Shamail Nadwi. He's an Islamic scholar, and he builds his case for God's existence using careful philosophical logic. And on the other side, we have Javed Akhtar, a famous poet and writer who argues as an atheist using reason and what we can learn from human history. They really represent the two poles of this entire conversation. Now, here's what makes their discussion so interesting. They agreed on one crucial ground rule: no quoting from religious books and no bringing in scientific evidence. The only tool they were allowed to use was pure logical reasoning that anyone from any background could follow. This really sets the stage for a true contest of ideas. So let's start with that argument from logic, the one presented by Mufti Nadwi. His goal is to show that God's existence isn't just a possibility, but a logical necessity, almost like a math problem. And to make his point, he uses a very simple analogy. Just imagine you're walking on a completely remote, isolated island. No one's ever been there before. And suddenly, right there on the sand, you find a bright pink ball. You'd never assume it just appeared out of nowhere. The immediate question you'd ask yourself is, how did this get here? You'd naturally assume that someone or something made it, and somehow it ended up on this island. The whole point of the analogy is to get us to ask that very same question about our universe. How did it get here? Let's just take a moment to think about this. Everything we see around us in our everyday lives has a cause, right? There's a reason it's there. This simple idea is the foundation for what we're going to look at next. Okay, so philosophers have a specific term for things like that pink ball. They call it a contingent being. It's a bit of a fancy phrase, but all it means is that its existence depends on something else. A tree depends on a seed and soil. A person depends on their parents. Our planet depends on gravity and stars. The point of the argument is that everything we see in the universe is contingent. But if everything depends on something that came before it, you eventually run into a big problem. You can't have a chain of causes that just goes back and back forever and ever with no beginning. It just doesn't work logically. So there must be a starting point. And this is what's called a necessary being, something that has to exist, that doesn't depend on anything else. It's the first cause that wasn't caused by something else. So here's how the argument stacks up, step by step. 1. Everything in the universe is contingent. It depends on something else. 2. Every contingent thing needs a cause. 3. That chain of causes can't go back forever. And 4. The logical conclusion is that there must be a first uncaused cause. And this, the argument says, is what we call God. All right, so that's the argument from pure logic. Now let's switch gears and look at the counter-argument. Javed Akhtar comes at this from a completely different place, not from abstract logic, but from the very real evidence of human history and the ideas we create ourselves. Akhtar's first point is to just look at history. Gods haven't always been the same. Think about it. The ancient Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, these were incredibly intelligent civilizations, and they believed in their gods, Ra, Zeus, Jupiter, just as strongly as anyone believes in theirs today. But where are those gods now? History seems to show, he argues, that gods change as cultures change. He then makes a really sharp distinction between two words we often use interchangeably. The first is belief. He defines belief as accepting something is true because you have some kind of reason or evidence or observation to back it up. For example, you believe the North Pole exists, not because you're told to, but because we have maps, photos, and scientific data. And that, he says, is totally different from faith. Faith, in his view, is when you're asked to accept something as true specifically without any evidence or logical proof. His point is that if there were proof for God's existence, you'd have belief. The very fact that religion asks for faith, he argues, suggests that the proof just isn't there.
He extends this idea of man-made concepts to things like morality. He points out that ideas like justice don't really exist in nature. The natural world runs on cause and effect, survival, not on what's right or wrong. A lion doesn't get put on trial for eating a deer. Justice, fairness, morality, these are all incredible concepts that we humans invented so that we could build stable societies. They aren't universal laws of the cosmos.
And this leads us to what is probably the most difficult and most emotional part of this whole conversation, the problem of suffering. How can a world with so much pain, cruelty, and injustice coexist with the idea of an all-powerful and all-loving creator? Well, the two sides offer explanations that are worlds apart. The theist perspective often suggests that suffering is a kind of test of our faith, or maybe it's the consequence of human free will. It's part of a much bigger divine plan that we just can't see. We're only seeing one tiny pixel of a giant picture. The atheist view counters that suffering is just a natural part of a universe that has no plan. And in fact, the sheer scale of truly horrific, random suffering is actually evidence against the idea of a benevolent, all-powerful being.
So, after going through these really powerful arguments from both sides, where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with two fundamentally different ways of seeing the universe, two different tools we can use to try and find an answer.
The first lens sees the entire universe as the logical product of a necessary first cause, something that has to exist outside of time and space for anything else to exist at all. The second lens sees the universe as something we have to understand using our own human tools, our ability to observe, to look at history, and to use our reason.
So in the end, this explainer was never about giving you a simple yes or no. It was about giving you a framework for thinking about the question. The real takeaway is to understand the different tools each side is using. One path relies on a chain of pure logic, the other relies on observable human evidence and rejects ideas that don't have proof. So the final question isn't just, does God exist? It's also which of these tools, logic, evidence, or faith, will you use to continue exploring the answer for yourself?